Hi, everyone. I'm Swabira Abdul Razak from the Kenya Red Cross Society. My colleagues are on this call as well. We have Tariq and Safia. They'll probably have introduced themselves before on a similar call. So I wouldn't waste any time, I'll just get straight into it. So our drones team have this thing we call our drones team, that we like drones for good. So that's our slogan that we go with. That's drones for good, right under Kenya Red Cross. So just a summary of what we'll go through today. Firstly, I'll allow you to meet the team, and then we'll show you the drone. And then, okay, great, it wasn't showing on my screen. Then we'll go through the different use cases, and then we'll take you through our journey from 2019, our inception. We'll go through some of the challenges that we have undergone in the last 3 years, what our next steps will be, and in general, our call to action. Moving forward, so on the next slide, we have our team here. I hope you can all see. I hope there's no lag on your side. We have Tariq and Safia, and a pool of 15 pilots who have been trained on different drones. So among these pilots, we have a mixture of both staff who are engaged under the Kenya Red Cross, and then we also have volunteer pilots under the Kenya Red Cross as well. So as you can see, we have 4 drones. 3 of them are rotors, and the other one is a hybrid of a fixed wing and a multi-rotor drone. There you go. So I'll start with on the bottom corner, no, bottom side. So the first one is a lot for our imagery and our documentation. The second drone, right and below it, is the DJI Enterprise 2. So we use this drone for documentation, but as well as dissemination. It has a loudspeaker payload that we have used in some projects. On my right, we have the third rotor, which is the DJI Agras G16. This is originally an agricultural drone, but we piloted this for disinfection under COVID-19. And then on my left, we have the Wingcha 1 mapping drone that we have piloted for mapping in different counties here in Kenya. Moving on to our use cases. So we have a couple of use cases that we have tested here. We have institutional documentation. We have done this here locally in Nairobi. We recently, actually not recently, back in 2019 when the team was still new, we piloted documentation in the Ifo2, the camp that's in Dadaab. Took some really cool maps and shots of the camp there, which was part of a larger project to give an end-to-end solution to the donor, because the camp was closed down at that point. Secondly, we have crop monitoring. We also do a lot of risk mapping that we did for COVID as well. We've done for floods. We also have risk and damage assessment. I think that's self-explanatory, but usually before or after an emergency. We also have search and rescue, and I think floods as well. We can get into that a bit later. And then we have emergency ops mapping. Next slide. Okay, so allow me to take you through the first 3 years of our journey. In 2019, this is when we had this smart idea of putting together a drones team. It currently sits under the innovation unit, and we started off with a 1-year special license from the local authority, that's the KCAA, who basically have handheld us through a lot of our processes here, including all the regulations that they have guided us through. Secondly, we signed an MOU with the training partner Alto Helix, and as well as a project manager. We decided to go into full-fledged training. We trained 15 individuals. Like I mentioned earlier, some of them are staff and some of them are volunteers. Then we went in the process of developing our different SOPs. So we basically have SOPs for each drone, which is basically your mission checklist, plans, reports. In after our first set of drones, which were the DJI Mavics, we got the 2 Pro and then the Enterprise. This was part of our ground school and in-class training. We tested this for a couple of use cases. And then we got the Wingcha 1, I believe, towards the end of the year, which is a fixed wing mapping drone. So as I mentioned before, we tested the Mavic 2 Pro, I believe, to map out a really big campsite that's in Dadaab here in Kenya. So that was a fun project. We had a lot of learnings which we can share along the way, but that was actually our first test with drones. Then we had another team that was deployed. We had floods in 2019 in Moyale. For those who have heard of it, it's notorious for floods. We had a team that went and conducted a search and rescue mission. We had our successes, and also we had a lot of learnings from that mission. So that was 2019. Moving into 2020. Okay, so before we go, maybe just to explain what's in those pictures. Top left, sorry, was, I believe that was Magarini. Yes, that was Magarini. We had gone with our trainers, and we're just being taught how to do mapping at that time, and some documentation from our ground school training back in 2019. And then 2020, we got an extension for our license from the authority. It was for 1 year. And we moved into training of the Wingcha 1 drone that we got in the previous year. We trained 10 packs, and we had fortunate to have our test flights out in the field. And for this, we piloted testing the drone for floods. At that time, it was in an area called Kajiado, Shompole specifically. FAO for the desert locust assessment. We're part of a larger team, but our key thing to do was basically to pitch the use of drones to support control measures, just to show how far the impact of the locusts were. I think if you see the picture, the bottom picture, where there's a map, it says acquisition date, 22nd May. So this was one of the outputs that shows the imagery collected from that project. So this is from Tharaka Nithi specifically. It's one of the counties here in Kenya. Basically shows you the different types of land. You have the cropland, forest land, what was bare soil, pasture land, and open water sources as well. So that was from FAO, the desert locust assessment. And then there's a landslide in 2020 that I think there were almost 20 lives lost at that time. So we did deploy a team to go and help with the efforts there. That was one of the hardest missions from what I've had. I wasn't part of that team, but I hear that it was madness on that side. So some learnings from there as well. Later in 2020, we got into partnership with MasterCard Foundation, again, part of a larger team. And here we piloted the 3 different drones, I believe, 2 actually, the Mavic 2 Enterprise for the loudspeaker to see how well dissemination would work on that drone. I think we did this in 3 counties. Yeah, 3 counties. We also did mapping of COVID-19 hotspots using the fixed wing drone. And we had some really good output that we then disseminated to the counties to help with any recovery efforts and just to inform the whole response. And then we also acquired the Agra drone. We piloted it for disinfections, and we were actually lucky enough to get a license to carry out night operations. So a lot of this disinfection was done at night, but during the day we had a different team on the ground doing a lot of dissemination, which we used our other drone as well. So that was fun, but very tiresome. The team worked day and night, had some really good learnings of that as well. So finally, in 2020, we got contracted by the ICRC to do some mapping and documentation for their new construction site. It's here in Nairobi in an area called Spring Valley. So every month we go and take for them basically a time lapse of the progress so far. So mapping, some documentation, some nice shots. So we've been doing that, I believe, since May, if I'm not wrong, still ongoing. Into 2021. So in 2021, we got a 2-year extension, really supportive through our process, I must say. So we got contracted by the RCMRD to support them in some crop vulnerability assessment. Sorry. So yeah, we sent a team there with our fixed wing drone in the Kingdom of Eswatini, took some maps, and later on gave them the data to analyze that. And then we, like I mentioned before, we are still working with ICRC for their documentation of their construction site. And then we're part of an agriculture workshop that the ICRC hosted, where we came in to help with some demonstrations. So we demonstrated the Wincher 1 drone, as well as the Agras, to a team of about 16 of us. That was a fun workshop altogether. So what we have ongoing is our ROC application. It's a step process, and I think, yeah, I won't go much into that. So down there, you can see all the partnerships and discussions that we have been fortunate to have in the last 3 years. I think you can see all of them. So what is that? Take us through our challenges, what our next steps are, and basically our call to action for the rest of the team.
Okay. So in terms of challenges, our main challenge really has been on the cost for equipment, looking at the maintenance required as well for some of these drones. These are things that we were not expecting, and we've had to learn along the way. With the whole program around the technology, around the processes, a lot of R&D and continuous improvement is required. And this is all investment in terms of the organization. We've also had significant challenges in the beginning in terms of how long it takes to turn around raw drone imagery into final map outputs that can be used by the GIS teams for further analysis. We've worked together with Dan on countless times in terms of improving this, and we are at a stage where we're at an acceptable level of performance in that. We're also looking at, when we first trained our pilots, we trained 15 pilots, but because they also have other jobs within the KRCS, you have staff that are not fully committed towards the program. So retention has been a big issue. Training people on new skills, keeping them, on the sticks in terms of their muscle memory, getting enough practice for them. Those have really been our challenges for the pilots that we have. We've also had issues around vendor lock-in, so getting accessories to work with our drones or software to work with them. Repairs and maintenance also mean that we have to go back to the manufacturer and basically what price they give us. These are some of the challenges we face. Regulations in the country have just recently been released. A couple of months ago, so we're in the process, of mentioned, to applying for our passport ticket. We're also looking at whether we should go into a model where we are also offering courses and certification on the drone space, but skewed to a humanitarian context. And then lastly, we have a lot of competition from other players, especially those with aviation backgrounds. We acknowledge that we can't do everything ourselves, but would like to cut out a niche for ourselves in terms of focusing on the humanitarian sector. In terms of looking forward, where we see ourselves going, it's really about strengthening the management and operations of the unit and possibly operating as an independent department. Currently, it sits under the innovation unit. We're also looking at developing and strengthening our operating procedures and manuals in line with best practices. These are continuously evolving with technology and processes and lessons learned from other partners. And so it's a dynamic document or SOPs that we look to keep up to date. The challenge that we have with our drone missions is that we have to deploy a team from Nairobi to the regions, our branches. So we're looking at what's the best way in terms of cascading all the three components of people, processes, and tech down to the field level where missions can be carried out more cost effectively. How can we acquire drones that are cheaper and make more financial sense in terms of maintenance at those levels? We're also looking at expanding some of the use cases, so things like medical supplies delivery. We currently operate within line of sight, but the country is not in a position to open up to beyond visual line of sight at the moment, but we would like to push that agenda, especially for the humanitarian context. We're also looking at addressing some of the challenges mentioned before, things like training, practice, maintenance, and upgrading our infrastructure, just to keep up. Continuous R&D is also important to us. If we're to reduce the pricing, if we're to ensure that we're not locked in by vendors, then we must spend time and effort into this. Lastly, we're acquiring our ROC status. This will allow us to build a sustainable model and offer the same services to other humanitarian agencies, and be able to pay for some of the costs that we have and not have this being invested, in multiple organizations at the same time. So we'd like, as much as possible, to be the lead in the humanitarian sector for the drone services. So a call to action to this family of ours. We really want to collaborate with all of you into disseminating the drone expertise that we have within the network. We think we need to shift our perspective to using drones as an innovative tools towards our work. In terms of next steps, we could explore partnerships with players in the commercial drone space. So we may not be able to invest ourselves, but a partnership model may be a suitable one. Have more organizations embracing drones for good and in the region. We're looking at, how do we finance this operation and make it sustain this initiative, but also how do we scale up? We can only do so much with the resources that we have. And then lastly, we think that a good approach would be for us to break down into smaller technical groups that would push specific projects or interest areas. So thank you. And then you can reach out to us on any of those email addresses there. I think Dan, you'll lead the next session.
Yeah, so if you have time, we'd love to open it up to some questions, if that's okay.
So we have a question on the chat about our training program. This is really in two parts. We have the in-class training, which is mostly about theory of flight and background towards. It's very similar to your private pilot license in terms of structure. After that, it's really about being type certified on the specific drones you intend to fly and practice missions. And then you get your licensing at that point. For now, we are not offering it commercially, but we have contracted companies in the past that worked with us to deliver the training internally.
Great, thank you. You also mentioned ROC status. What does that stand for? And it sounded like you'd already been kind of contracted by ICRC and another UN agency to do some mapping. So what's the relation between that status and some of your other work that sounded like it was paid?
Kenya on humanitarian need. The ROC is the RPAS Operator Certificate, which means that you are, through the Civil Aviation Authority, you are licensed to carry out these operations. And this came after the regulations were released in the country. Now, what they have given us an exemption up to the end of next year, but they have encouraged us to formalize our application so that we are an official RPAS operator in the country. This then, prevents conflict with other drone operators in the country who are paying licensing fees, who are, required to adhere to strict regulations. So we must also follow the same. We can't operate under an exemption for that long.
Got it. Thank you. There's a question in the chat. Is there any legislation on procurement, importation, and use of drones apart from the permission license from Civil Aviation Authority?
So the only people that can import a drone are either resellers or operators. Once you have that status, then you would apply for the import. The Civil Aviation Authority would review the type of drone, the intended use case, and the payloads. And then after that, they would then either grant you or deny you the request for import. Once you've done that and it's approved, then you can do your import.
Great, thank you. Do you have any sort of insurance policy? And if so, are there any details on how you cover both your staff and your 15 volunteer pilots?
So because we didn't have regulations in the country, there was no insurance provider locally that was providing it up to 2020 when they started. So we are forced to work with international insurance companies that cover drone insurance. And these are usually in two parts. One is the third party and the second one is the hull insurance. But we have faced trouble recently where technical problems on the drone are not insured. So those must be covered under warranty or under maintenance plans with the drone manufacturer.
Makes sense. I was curious about the loudspeaker on the DJI Enterprise and using that for the COVID work. How did people react to that? And did you collect any community feedback on if they thought it was helpful or if they thought it was kind of an invasion of privacy?
So for the loudspeaker payload, we use this during COVID-19. We did a lot of dissemination using this drone. So it was bittersweet because yes, people were interested in what the drone was saying, but one, it was a major distraction to the crowd. You'll find it was pulling crowds opposed to actually, and then it was COVID time, so there's no blessing in pulling a crowd during, and I remember it was a food distribution, so the crowd was more interested in looking at the drone and trying to figure out how it's working. Also, the props on the Mavic are really loud. So we struggled with this a bit, is that we had to fly the drone higher. What we realized is the higher you fly the drone, the louder the message would be, or the more audible and clear. But then as well, when you're flying near a crowd, that questioned our SOPs as well. So there's a lot that comes into play. But to answer your question, there was a couple of learnings. We even tried to research on ways to make the speaker louder. Can we purchase a different payload? So that's conversation for another day. But it's happened to distract the crowd more. Yes, in some counties we did pass the message, but we wouldn't recommend it for dissemination. It was a pilot and we have learnings around that, but it wouldn't be a recommendation for us.
Great, thank you. There's another question in the chat. You said there's a need for more open source. I was wondering in what areas exactly, apart from when it comes to sharing data, for example, labeled data for image recognition applications, what other use cases need more open source?
In terms of open source, we're looking at it from a couple of fronts. One is on the processing side. What we've realized is that we are able to stitch the images together, but we'd like to get to a point where we can do more advanced applications in terms of doing surveillance and image classification. There has been a lot of progress on this in the open source world, but we're also looking at it from the hardware perspective. I mean, being locked into a single pricing is ridiculous in terms of if we want to scale our services, then we have to look at open source alternatives. That's our thinking on that.
Great, thank you. What mission planning software do you use for the mapping flights currently?
We have two. So on the DJI platform, we plan with the DJI software. And then on the fixed wing mapping drone, which is Wingtrap, it has its own mission planning software, which is called the Wingtrap Pilot. For processing, it's we use a mix of two. Currently, it's Pix4D or WebODM, Open Drone Map.
Great. Is the crop monitoring that you mentioned for the benefit of individual farmers, or is it for awareness of agricultural production levels across a region?
Sorry. So for the crop monitoring, we've done this for a couple of missions. We tested for with our own farms. So Kenya Red Cross has engaged beneficiary farmers to not only help inform better ways of farming, but also to provide for the communities in that area. So yeah, so some of them were beneficiary farmers under the Kenya Red Cross. And then most recently, that was for the NDMA of the Eswatini Kingdom. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I think there's been some questioning of the effectiveness of the spray disinfection for COVID. Are there other use cases that you have planned for the DJI Agras in the future?
Yes, you're very right in terms of the effectiveness of COVID. I think the biggest challenge is on the frequency. So they recommend that you should do, I think minimum was around 24 hours, depending on which health worker you talk to. So there is no consensus even locally in terms of what's the frequency you need to be spraying the disinfectant. So the Agras, I think for us, it's more about the precision farming. So as Kenya Red Cross, we work with communities in terms of large scale food security projects where we help work with them to run farms with drip irrigation, with modernized agricultural methods. So this is one area that we look into exploring with them as well. Their capacity is also available for us to open it up to commercial applications as well.
Cool, I'm sure we'll be interested to hear more about that. A question from the chat, would you be willing to share your SOP operating manual?
Yes, we'd definitely, as long as it's within the family, we'd definitely be interested.
Okay. I will just be sure to note when we send it out, any restrictions on sharing, keeping that internal to the network and stuff like that. There's a question, is going out as a standalone unit a more feasible way as compared to being part of a bigger department, looking at the high costs of managing the drone program? Any assessment you have done or considering doing?
So what we're looking at doing is developing a business case for this. Currently, we're supported by programs. So if a program is interested in running a drone activity, then they would contract us to do that. So aside from the investment costs, we really don't have any costs to the unit, only when we're running a mission. So that's staff time and the resources required to mobilize, get us on site and bring us back. What we would be doing is to look at if we increase the amount of business that's coming towards the unit, does it make financial sense for us to run it as a separate company even? So that's what we're in the process of doing at the moment.
Interesting. Joel, does that answer your question? And there's another question from Katie. Great presentation. Sorry if I missed it, but are you doing any community surveys or interviews to understand what community members think about the use of drones?
So during our missions, we are forced by the regulator to work with the local community. In terms of the county, the security agencies, and any other agencies that would be involved or have an interest. So that's on the stakeholder management. We also have the community representation at that point. Usually we get a lot of heat from the local security agencies in terms of why exactly you're flying a drone. In the country, especially outside the cities, hasn't been that much. Some of them are seeing drones for the first time. So really it's about myth busting and looking at, you know, what's our intention and our purpose of being there, come up with after we carry out our mission. And what we've seen is that it takes us with our missions. The county governments would give us, you know, access to all these areas. They would close off the markets at night and make sure that we have access, like in the example of disinfection. Community members would even give us water to do the spraying with. So they would bring their own water in jerry cans, and because we had no water that we went with on our own, for example. So they are open to these things. And we've had very good responses.
Great, thanks for that. Are there any other questions from the group? Okay, thank you so much for taking the time to present today. It's amazing to see all the great work you're doing and how far you've really pushed the use of drones and the multiple different areas you're kind of exploring and seeing how you can integrate this into different programs and activities. And really fascinating to hear kind of your future plans and how you might be looking at making this more sustainable and scaling it up. We look forward to learning more from you. And I'm sure there'll be additional questions in the future as people have some time to digest and think about what they heard today. And we look forward to connecting.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Dan.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.